guys, welcome into the Shadow Box. I am Carlise, your host. I am your grief and trauma coach and your shadow work guide. Today I have with us Erin Blechman. Erin is a speaker. She is also a certified grief educator whose mission is to elevate the conversation around grief and loss, mental illness, and suicide. She is an author of My Unexpected Journey, which is a reflection of losing her son, Max, and he also passed away of suicide. She is also a grief support facilitator for bereaved parents through online groups and community talks that seek to build greater understanding of mental illness, suicide, loss, and grief. Erin lives part-time in both Pennsylvania and Florida with her husband, Bill, and Max's former dog, Emmylou. So, Erin, go ahead and give us some more information about yourself and bring us into your world.
Okay. Well, I love when Emmylou comes up because she is like having a little piece of Max. But as you said, I live part-time in Florida and Pennsylvania, so I'm very fortunate to be able to be in those places when they're the loveliest and the other places not. And Bill and I have one other son. We have a son, Sam. His name is Sam. He's 27 years old and he lives in the Pittsburgh area with his wife. He was married about a year ago. And gosh, that is a whole story in and of itself. His wife has been just a godsend to him and to our family. So we're very grateful for her. But yeah, I'm a mom, and I was fortunate to have two beautiful boys, Max and Sam. And from a young age, it became apparent that Max was very sensitive and tenderhearted. And that eventually turned into a mental health condition that he struggled with for a long time. And we ended up losing him in June of 2020 to suicide after it was really probably 6 years of pretty intense, both physical and mental illness that he struggled with. And so therefore we struggled alongside of him.
Yeah, and I can only imagine that the grief journey between yourself, your husband, and then your son Sam as well. So we have his wife that has come along, and she's kind of like that cushion for him, that support for him. And because you guys all grieved differently, I can only imagine, and all went through the process of Max's mental illness differently as well. So kind of walk us through what that looked like for Max and how it really impacted the family.
So when I look back, I can see signs of it from the time he was a little boy because his reactions to things were always bigger than the rest of ours. And I've told this story a million times, but we had a little Karen Terrier puppy that we got when the boys were young. I think Max was 10 and Sam was 7. And she was a feisty little thing. We live in a wooded area, but it's very close to, busy roads and lots of shopping and things of that nature. And although we had an electric fence, she escaped from our yard umpteen times, too many times to count. And so, Sam and Max and I would go in the woods searching for her, and we would be calling her name, and Sam and I would be concerned, but Max's level of agitation and I guess just his anxiety was just at a much greater level. And, he would be crying and saying, Mom, what happens if she gets hit by a car? What happens if she gets attacked by another dog? What happens if, she gets injured? So his level of, again, his emotions were just bigger than the rest of ours. And so I see numerous signs of that throughout his young life. But then when he got to high school, he started to have gastrointestinal issues. We went to many doctors, had, all sorts of physical tests, an endoscopy, a colonoscopy, a CT scan, numerous tests to try to find the physical reason for his gastrointestinal issues. And looking back, I think it was just the beginning of his pretty serious depression and anxiety.
Yeah.
And then at 19, almost 19, he went away to college, and within 6 weeks, he ended up in the hospital for what would be his first visit for suicide ideation. He ended up withdrawing from school and coming home. And that was really the start of, I would say, the pretty serious decline that happened over the course of the next 5 or 6 years. until we lost.
Yeah. When when they talk about the GI issues that happen when you are experiencing anxiety, your GI or your area there, your gut is like your other central nervous system.
Mhm.
And so that usually starts to act up when you are experiencing some sort of traumatic event, some sort of reaction to the traumatic event, actually. And so it's not surprising that because they didn't find anything, right?
Mm-mm.
Yeah. So that was his anxiety showing itself in, in a physical way. And when he went to my first question, when he was experiencing the heightened emotions when he was a child, was he ever tested for like ADHD or autism or anything like that?
He was never tested for autism. We did have him tested for ADHD. I think he was in fourth grade because Max was incredibly bright. He really had a brilliant mind. He spoke in full sentences at 15 months. He read his first Harry Potter book between kindergarten and first grade. He was really a smart kid, but he had trouble switching gears. And that was apparent from preschool. Like the teachers would say, he would get so engrossed in something that when it was time to switch, he had a difficult time. And that continued, but he did well in school. And it wasn't until fourth grade that we had him tested for ADHD, and he was right on the borderline. We only had him tested once. We had him tested at the school he was attending at the time, and we never really pursued that. Later, when he was, I guess it was one of his semesters in college, he was seeing a psychiatrist for his antidepressants and his anti-anxiety meds. And they talked about ADHD and ended up putting him on, I don't even remember what it was, but it was something to treat ADHD. But what happened, because what I didn't mention is at 20, he developed epilepsy. He just started having seizures out of the blue. And so a lot of times the medications used to treat ADHD lower a person's seizure threshold. And so it was a bad combination for him.
Yeah.
He was in the process of trying to get his seizures under control with other medication, and then putting him on a medication to treat ADHD was counteracting that. So he was only on a medication. I don't think it was Ritalin. I don't recall what it was, but he was on it for a very short period of time
Yeah.
for that reason.
And that's the scary thing about mental illness, especially when you have other facets that could be playing a part in it. And, if he was right on the borderline of ADHD, and then he had some neurological issues going on that, led him to being epileptic, it's like all of these things that were going on. It's like it almost makes you wonder, like, were these the causes? And we'll never know. But it's like, these different circuits that are going on in his brain, and how he's feeling about them, and the feelings that they're making, come up in him. It could have been a wiring issue that he couldn't handle, and no one was able to pinpoint it, which, eventually kind of led to this road that he had to suffer down. Okay. And so now he's in college, and he went to the hospital for his first suicidal ideation. How were you notified? And then how did that progress from there?
So he was in college out of state at that time. And, this was back in the day of landlines. It was in 2013. And he called us, actually. He called us from his dorm room and told us that he had just called 911 on himself because he was having these thoughts and he had a plan. So the paramedics came to get him. And then we drove down to his school, which was a couple of states away. And, Carlise, Max was such an interesting kid, and he could be so gregarious at times. Most of the time he was gregarious. He was an introvert, but he could walk into a room and he could talk to people and make them laugh and, be the center of attention. It was just always such an interesting dichotomy to me. But anyway, it was just so hard for us to understand.
Yeah.
It was it was then that he was diagnosed with major depressive disorder. And, we had talked to him in the weeks leading up to this numerous times because we knew he was struggling.
Yeah.
And then we go down, and as we're withdrawing him from school, cleaning out his dorm room, throngs of other kids came to say goodbye to him. And it was so difficult for us to reconcile this, the scene in front of us where all these people were, pouring out love and attention on him, and him feeling like he didn't fit in. He didn't have any friends. He wasn't in the right place. It was very, very difficult to reconcile. And frankly, that was something that we struggled with the entire time that he was with us, was trying to understand what he was going through, because it was what he verbalized was so different than what we saw and what we knew about him. And, that was very, very difficult, and particularly difficult as his mom, because, I saw his intellect. I saw his gifts. I saw his talents. I saw all that he could contribute to this world, all that he was contributing. And he just couldn't see any of it. He just really, I think it was the depression and then the epilepsy, which caused him to lose his license and, lose his independence. They just really sapped him of his motivation, his self-esteem, his independence, and, ability to really, like I said, see himself the way we saw him.
Yeah. And that is always interesting to see how the external almost never really sees the internal appropriately. Mm-hmm. And the things that and I wonder, like, well, did he even know what he was searching for? Mm. Because there's so much of the outside that's coming in, and we love you, and he was popular in a sense, but something that he was wanting or looking for, or even again, those wires crossing of saying something is not enough, was inevitably the thing that caused him to feel like, I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so now we kind of go down that road, Erin, of him finally deciding to make this decision. Go ahead and tell us what kind of led up to that, and you're coming to find out or get that call.
Yeah. So he was hospitalized for the last time in early 2020. And then he got out. That was his last stay in a psychiatric hospital for suicide ideation. And, the psychiatric hospital in our area, I don't know if they're all like this, but we were never very impressed. It was a place to keep him safe. That was it. Mm-hmm. There was really really no treatment that occurred there. Very little therapies, very few activities. It was basically like a prison. And so he would be there for a few days, and then of course he'd be itching to get out because it was boring and unproductive. And then, he would go from that back to real life. And it was, again, just such a dichotomy. Like, how do you do that? How do you go from what's essentially a prison where you can't have anything? You can't have your phone, you can't have your laptop, you can't have shoelaces because they're afraid that you're going to do something to yourself. And then you're released to home where you have access to everything in the world. The system is, I think it's very flawed and needs to be rehauled. But anyway, he was really on an upward trajectory from there. He had a medication-resistant depression, so he tried umpteen antidepressants, but he was trying a new one during that time, and he was really starting to understand the correlation between self-care and lifestyle factors and how he felt. And so he was very into, at that time, Thai kickboxing, which is called Muay Thai. And he was going to the gym 4 or 5 days a week to do that. He had gotten his license back about a year and a half before that. He was an Uber driver, and he was in the process of trying to unionize the Uber drivers in Pittsburgh. And so he was very much an activist. So he had a very busy, full life. He had a beautiful girlfriend that he loved, we loved. He had his dog, Emmy, who was kind of like a therapy dog. So things were really looking up. And then COVID hit. And he lost everything. He lost his job. Obviously, nobody was taking Ubers in back in mid 2020. His gym closed because everything was closed, and so he just really kind of had the rug pulled out from under him. And in addition to that, there was just so much social and political upheaval at that time. We were in the middle of a very contentious election, and he just felt things very deeply and couldn't keep all of that stuff out. So he ended up leaving us June 3rd, 2020. And, I really hesitate, based upon all that I've learned about suicide, to say that he made the decision to leave us.
Okay.
Because with suicide, when people make that decision, they're not in their right frame of mind. So to think that it's a well thought out, well rationalized decision is really, that's really not accurate.
Yeah.
Studies show that people make that decision to take their life within 15 minutes. And so, there's lots of research out of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention that indicates it's really not a decision. And we got a note from him. He left us a note, and I think this really kind of explains it. He said that he felt like he was in a burning building and the only thing to do was jump. And so I think that indicates that it wasn't a choice. He didn't feel like he had a choice. It was
Yeah.
it was really his only option to stop the pain. So
Yeah.
so anyway, but we got the call, early in the morning on June 3rd. My husband actually took it. I was still in bed. It was a little bit before 8 o'clock. And, I heard Bill come crashing up the steps, and I was, waking up, and I heard him say, "Max is gone. He's gone." And, I couldn't wrap my head around the words that he was saying. And in my head, my first thought was, gone where? And so it's just, we thought that we might lose him to suicide. We knew that that was a potential, but still, when it happened, we were completely blindsided and just completely overwhelmed with the pain of what had happened. So it was, obviously that day is a blur. Those first weeks and months are a blur, frankly. But we started to call friends and family to tell them that we had lost Max, and people came to our home, and we undertook writing his obituary and planning his visitation and his memorial service. Again, all in the midst of COVID, and it was just
Overwhelming.
horrific.
I mean, because, no one talks about that aspect of what COVID really did for, there were people who had parents and grandparents who were in the senior citizen homes and that were dying, and they couldn't get to them.
Yeah.
And so now we have people who are suffering, like Max, suffering from mental health problems, and they don't have that outlet anymore. And it was only months down the road or it was a while down the road before people really caught on and said, let's do this telehealth thing.
Right.
So, all of a sudden Zoom really became prevalent in life because they were able to still see their clients. And, for Max, I can only imagine for everything to be stripped away from him when he was just starting to really hone things in. And it only takes just a moment for things to kind of start to unravel, especially because we're in a pandemic. Then we are in, like you said, with the political things going on, he didn't have a way to get it all out. And so it just started to close in on him. And I just think that, we can go down the rabbit hole of COVID. We can go down the rabbit hole of the psychiatric places. Like there's this whole thing of what should have happened, how it should have been handled, that could have saved a lot of people. And I believe that Max could have been one of them.
Yeah.
So now we're in this place of you having to really sit in the reality that Max is gone. And I also wanted to point out too that it's interesting that you said that the decision is not made. It's kind of like a snap decision, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if that is something to be researched to, and like you said, there's been research done. I'm just wondering, like, well, prior when Max had the suicidal ideation, he was planning, so it was a plan. And so some people plan and then some people just do. So it's like, it just makes me wonder, like it leads up to that final moment
Mm-hmm.
where they just make that split decision. I hate to use it because I know you don't like that word, but they make that split decision to, because they've ran out of options. So they feel.
Yep.
That's a really interesting twist on suicide and people who acted out. Now, since Max has been gone, how did that change the dynamic of the family? How did it change the dynamic of your marriage? Did it at all change the dynamic of your marriage?
Yeah. Gosh, I could cry just thinking about that. So I remember at the visitation, it was in the middle of COVID, but we still somehow had hundreds of people that came through the funeral home. I have no idea how that happened. I don't know how the funeral home allowed it. I don't know how we weren't, freaked out by it. It was, literally hundreds of people came through a visitation line for us. We cremated Mac, so we didn't have like the traditional casket, but it was still a room full of pictures, full of people with the family. And so I remember it was a couple days later, and I was so consumed with my own grief and pain that I I didn't really know what was going on with Bill and Sam. And not that I didn't care, but I didn't have the bandwidth to even ask or pay attention. I was just in such intense pain. And so a few days later, I remember, maybe it was a couple weeks later, I remember somebody saying that they thought Sam looked just like a lost puppy at the visitation, because it was, me and Bill and then Sam. And, so people would come through, and I just think he didn't know what to do. He'd never been in that situation before. So, it was in the days after Max left us that his now wife, came into the picture.
Okay.
She is the daughter of a very good friend of mine. And she and Sam met when Sam was probably in 5th or 6th grade. So they knew each other. They went to the same school. They were in different friend groups, but we would do periodically things together as a family. So, go to parties, go to church together, whatever. So they knew each other, but weren't really close. And so, she properly stepped into his life then, and she became his support system. And that was, Sam and I had one conversation about Max the summer that Max died. And that was honestly like the last one we had for a couple of years, because he couldn't talk about it. I couldn't talk about it. And so, Julia is her name. And she, like I said, she's just been an absolute godsend. She has been his rock. And I'm just so grateful. And, I remember thinking, I don't remember when I first had this thought, but it was sometime over the course of those couple of years. I thought he's in better hands with her than he would be with me, because I was just a mess. I was drowning in my own grief that I couldn't be there for him. So, so that's kind of Sam. And then with Bill and I, we grieved so differently. It's almost like we lost a different person. So, the summer that Max died, I had a really hard time getting out of bed. I was definitely struggling with a depression of my own. And, looking back, it's hard to say I'm thankful for it, but what it did was it opened my eyes to what he dealt with day in and day out: the darkness, the lack of motivation, just the despair that he felt. And so I am thankful for that lesson. I'm thankful that I learned that. But that was sort of, the way I was dealing with it. And my husband was kept very, very busy. So he would he works full time. He would work in our yard. We have a little bit of property, so he would go out and he would, cut down trees and rake things and dig things. And he just stayed so busy. Go to the gym, work out, go for bike rides. Just he stayed so busy that at night he would literally fall into bed exhausted.
Yeah.
And so there was obviously a little bit that was a rub. I thought I would look at him and think, who are you? How are you even functioning? And he would look at me and think, who are you? Why are you in bed? Why can't you get up? So that was very difficult. And through my therapist and our marriage therapist, we were able to work through that. I remember at one point my therapist said, because he would come to the door of the bedroom and he'd say, "Are you going to get up today?"
Mm.
And sometimes I would drag myself out of bed because I just, I felt the pressure. I felt guilty. But I ultimately got to the point where I would say, my therapist told me I could stay in bed. And he would say, okay. So he would leave and I would stay in bed. So through with my therapist and through our marriage counselor, we kind of learned how to navigate the differences in our grief and learned that men and women grieve differently. And it's okay. And we would be okay as long as we didn't judge each other for the way we were grieving.
Yeah.
Gosh, I got to tell you, that's hard. That's really hard. It's so easy to judge because, you only know what you're thinking and feeling. And so you think that that's right. You think that that's
Yeah.
normal. And so it was really good advice. And it's what allowed us, frankly, to make it through probably that first year, because things were very, very difficult. And then it was right around the year anniversary that we realized we weren't doing well. And,
Mm-hmm.
right around that year, I think we all thought if we can make it to a year, if we can just get
Yeah.
through this year. And then the year anniversary came and went, and we not only didn't feel better, in some ways we felt worse.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I've again expressed this numerous times, but I think that first year, you're just getting through all the firsts,
Yeah.
through the first birthday, the first holidays, the first anniversary. And, you're kind of holding on for dear life. And then the second year starts and you're just staring down at forever without him. Without him as part of our family, without all of the milestones that he would not be achieving, like getting married, like having kids,
Mm-hmm.
like doing all the things that he dreamed of. So anyway, it was at that point that again, Sam's beautiful wife stepped in. She did some research and she found a support group, she actually found a couple. She interviewed the facilitators and settled on one. And she and Sam joined it first. And then Bill and I joined it a couple weeks later. It was online again because everything was still online at that point. It was still COVID. And that group has been a lifesaver. I still attend periodically, and I always tell the facilitator that has been the single biggest factor in my healing, because
Yeah.
I finally felt like people understood. I
Mm-hmm.
finally felt like our experience wasn't just so out of the ordinary. There were other people who had been through it, who were a few years down the road, that were living, that had survived it. And so it gave us hope. It again normalized and just validated our experience. And that was just huge, just
Yeah.
absolutely huge.
And for you and Bill, I mean, you guys eventually, and this is still new. We're not talking about 15 years ago or anything. This is still relatively new. And for you and Bill, it was important for you guys to get into that grief group because you understand that people are speaking your language.
Mhm.
And it also let you guys acknowledge too that just because you have different styles of how you handle the grief doesn't mean that you guys aren't speaking the same language.
Mm.
You guys are speaking the grief language, the hurt language, the language of the impossibility of being able to swallow the reality of this.
Mm.
But we're all just acting out in different ways to cope with it.
Yeah.
And so I believe that is that is one of the key things that people can do and couples can do when they're going through the grief, because usually death of a child, of what I have heard, really can tear marriages apart.
Mhm.
because of the way different ways of grieving, and because parents start to blame each other for certain things and they're feeling guilty for certain things. And I think that with you and Bill having your own therapist and going through the support group, it probably was a saving grace for you guys. Now that you've started to learn how to ride the wave, because that's basically what you guys are doing. Now that you've learned how to do that, are you guys able to talk about it and kind of intertwine with each other's grief, or is it still very separate?
So, it's interesting. Since we lost Max, one of the things that I did during that first year and a half, really the first 2 years after losing him, is well, first I started journaling at the recommendation of my therapist because I just couldn't make sense of my swirling thoughts and feelings. So she encouraged me to journal. Then I started putting some of those journal entries out on social media because it was, I was kind of tired of running into people in the produce section of the grocery store
Yeah.
and then them asking me how I was.
Yeah.
And so I thought, if people want to know, I'm going to tell them. So I started putting these really raw and real journal entries out on social media and got really incredible response. People really resonated with what I was saying. And so, and then I was connecting with people that I hadn't talked to in years. And anyway, over the course of probably the first 6 months after losing him and doing that, I was sort of given the idea to write a book. And so I started to take those journal entries and compile them. I found a graphic designer at my church who I started to work with to lay out the book, to create illustrations. And that was a big project. And so that is really, I think, what kept me going for the first couple of years. It was something to do with my grief. It was a productive way to remember Max and to honor him. And so it was frankly what got me out of bed.
Yeah.
And so, the other thing about it is I was trying to create a resource that would have been helpful for me because I read
Yeah.
everything I could get my hands on. I read every book that I could find on, grief or child loss. And some of them were helpful, many of them weren't. And I wanted to create something that would have been beneficial to me, something that had heavy content, important content about child loss and grief and mental illness and suicide, but also balance that with some beauty. And I think that I achieved that goal.
Yeah.
So that was frankly sort of my purpose for those first couple of years. The book chronicles the 18 months following his death. And then it came out just right before the second anniversary of his death. And so, and then since the book has come out, I have continued to connect with moms that have children who struggle with a mental illness, people that have been touched by suicide, bereaved moms, bereaved parents. And so that has now led into what I think is really my goal and my purpose and my mission. So anyway, Bill has been along for that whole ride. And I frankly think it was during one of our conversations, Carlise, that he basically, you made me realize that he basically has processed this through kind of all of the activities that I've been doing. And I never went to him and said, honey, I want to write a book and release it into the world that airs all of our family's information, our story. Are you okay with that? I never asked him that. And so I think that by him walking alongside me through this time, it's allowed us to kind of come together without needing to sit down and talk about how are you feeling? How are you feeling? So yeah.
Being able to have that difference, because everyone's not able to sit down and have those conversations because it could be way too intense.
Mm-hmm.
And putting people on the spot when they're grieving differently, instead of allowing them to just come alongside and pick up on certain things, pick up on your strengths, pick up on your weaknesses, even to say for both of you guys, how can I be strong when he's weak? when I pick up on how he's, coming across this day or during this time of the month, just by pure observance, I can come in and step in and be of some help to him.
Yeah.
And so when he was trying to pull you out of bed and he's like, come on, come on, come on, that wasn't working for you. It wouldn't have helped for you to be like, come on, Bill, let's go to the mall. He's like, no, I'd rather mow the lawn,
Yeah.
But the way that you guys have taken the steps with each other to learn each other and to respect and give each other room to feel how you are feeling individually and learning from each other. And we spoke about this too, of how men do grieve differently and some of them won't go to therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Did Bill go to therapy himself or did he just?
He did. He had an individual therapist for probably the first 6 months after Matt died, and then he stopped.
Yeah.
And that was an issue. That was another rub between us because I knew how helpful my therapist was for me. And so I tried to convince him for probably the next year and a half to go back or to find a new one. And he didn't. And, that's okay. He was doing what was best for him. So
yeah. And here he was coming alongside of you, watching you grow, watching you turn your pain into purpose.
Mm.
And in turn, it was helping him. It was healing him. It was kind of he was getting your strength, because that's for him to know, for you guys to know each other the way that you know each other. And I mean, you guys been married for years, to see each other in states that are so vulnerable and in places where you can't help. You can't even help yourself, let alone help your spouse. And so when he's seen you start to pick yourself up and start to, do different things with your pain, it in turn just gave him a little boost, like, hey, we're going to get through this. We're going to be okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So now we're going to kind of flip this all the way over. And I am going to ask you, how are you doing? How are you now that we're a couple of years into this? Your identity has changed. You're still a mother, but now you are also a bereaved mother.
Mm.
So our identity, once, first you're an individual, and then you're a mother. I'm sorry, and then you're a wife, and then you're a mother. And now, so those are all just identity changes. And now poor Max has passed away. Now you're a bereaved mother. All of these things are so intertwined in who you are. How has this experience that you've had, how has it changed your identity, and what did it expose about yourself that you either want to keep or either want to change?
What a good question. So before I answer that, though, I just realized that my computer is not plugged into its charger. And so I have to run and get that, Carlise. So if you would just give me a minute.
Okay.
My goodness, I'm so sorry.
No, this is fine. This is real life podcasting going on here.
It's real life.
This is real life. This is real life. It is what it is.
4.5 years in, I still blame things on Grief Brain. And the fact that I didn't have my charger in here, I'm chalking it up to Grief Brain. But so, how have I changed? Well, I've just learned so much. I've learned in the 4.5 years, almost 5 years, it'll be 5 years this June since we lost Max. I've learned so much about mental illness that I didn't know, that I didn't want to know when he was struggling, because it was just so scary to me. I just wanted my baby to be better. That's all I wanted. And so I've learned a lot about mental illness and just the stigma and the differences between, the differences in the way we treat mental and physical illness, which needs to change. I've learned a lot about suicide. I didn't know anything about suicide, even though he struggled with suicide ideation for several years. Again, talk about a topic you don't want to face as a parent. So I've learned about, the correct terminology, saying a person died by suicide versus committed suicide, because committed just perpetuates the stigma. It's a word that's used to describe illegal and immoral behavior. And, a little bit about, it's not really a decision. It's often the only choice people think they have. And then, gosh, have I learned a ton about grief. I knew nothing about grief prior to losing Max. I had lost grandparents, but they were elderly. And, that's kind of the circle of life. You expect them to go. They were older, had lived full lives. And so I was just completely overwhelmed by my grief, to the point where I didn't think I was going to make it, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to make it. Yeah. So I learned a lot those first couple of years through writing my book, through reading other books, through, listening to podcasts and things of that nature. There was a joke between me and a friend that during those first couple of years, I was just throwing, frankly, a bunch of shit against the wall to see what would stick.
Yeah.
Some of it did, a lot of it didn't. But anyway, and then, after my book came out, I really started to connect with these bereaved moms, and I felt like I needed more tools in my toolbox. So I became a certified grief educator. And that, I love that you say, turn my pain into purpose. That's exactly what has happened. And so I've learned about grief. I've learned the concepts and the terms that applied to what I thought and felt and didn't know what it was. And so I really try to share that with the bereaved moms and dads that I come into contact with in my grief groups, because I think that education is really critical. It's empowering. Just to, the bottom line is, when you're grieving, you feel like you're doing it wrong. You feel like there's something wrong with you, and you feel all alone. And so to know that others understand, and to learn that what you're feeling is just the normal, natural response to losing someone so beloved is just incredibly powerful and validating.
Yeah.
So, but I would say, kind of my heart now, because I've thought about, did I want to become a mental health advocate? Did I want to become a suicide prevention advocate? Did I want to become just a grief expert? And where I've landed, again, 4.5 years later, is I want to come alongside bereaved moms.
Yeah.
I want bereaved moms to know that they can survive the death of their child. Because at the beginning, it doesn't seem like you can. You don't really want to. You have this tremendous yearning to be with the one who's lost, in spite of all the people you still have in your life. And so I just want those moms to know that they can do it. It's going to be hard, and it's going to require an incredible amount of work, but it's possible.
It's definitely
possible to survive that loss and, truly grieve the loss of your child, but fully live and be okay with that. The and both. It's not an either or. And so what really breaks my heart, Carlise, is when I hear these stories of these moms who 10, 15 years later are still in that deep, dark despair that I was in the early days of grief. And that just breaks my heart, because I think I understand why they're there. I get it, but they don't have to be. And that's really my heart, is to come alongside them through education, through support, through, just compassionate understanding, to help them know that they can live, they can survive.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love hearing you say that, as far as, you understand that deep darkness that they're in, but they don't have to stay there. And that is a very sensitive spot for some people, because they don't believe, or they don't know that they don't have to be there. You have the right to feel how you feel. And again, there's so many different losses, but when we're speaking the language of grief, we don't have to stay where we were yesterday, as in putting it into today. It's okay for you to be able to heal. It's okay for you to find different avenues to utilize your grief. And it doesn't mean that you've forgotten about your loved one, and it doesn't mean that you love them any less. And so I think that people stay in that darkness, because if I leave here, that means I'm leaving them behind, and that's just not the truth. That's not the
Yeah.
truth. So I love that you're there. And I've had this conversation with another lady that I had on the podcast, and it's always refreshing to hear that. And I told her a little bit about how I even came into doing this podcast, because I had my own little breakthrough, which felt like a breakdown, And when I had that, I really my thought process on grief totally changed.
Mm.
And I understood that I didn't have to be in that space anymore. That there was light at the end of the tunnel, that I had permission to go through, and I had permission to live in, And so I just, that I love that. I love that you understood the assignment that was given at that time, right? So another thing that was interesting. So now we're gonna go a little personal,
Okay.
because I asked you, I said, tell me what you found out about yourself, your identity.
Oh.
And it's still, identity is within surrounding your grief, surrounding your loss, surrounding what you can do for others in the service of what you've lost. So is it safe to say that you're still trying to find your identity, that you don't know who you are right now?
Well, I mean, I still consider myself a mom, obviously. I still consider myself a mom of two boys. That boy, talk about a loaded question for bereaved parents. How many kids do you have?
Yeah.
So many of us freeze when we get that call or when we get that question, because, what do I say? Do I say I have one because I have one that's living, or do I say I have two and one's in heaven? And then it becomes awkward. And then the conversation, then I end up comforting the person who's asked the question. It's just, so I still consider myself a mom of two beautiful boys, Max and Sam. Prior to that, prior to losing him, I considered myself a mom. I've always been a wife. My husband and I have been married for 34 years, and we have been very fortunate to just have been able to stay together through the ups and the downs. He's my best friend, and just has been a wonderful father, a wonderful husband, a wonderful friend to me. So I can still consider myself those things. And then I think what is different is now, my identity is in this work that I'm doing. Being an author. Did I ever think I would write a book and be an author? No. I expected Max to write a book. He was a writer. He wrote poetry, short stories, stand-up comedy routines. And so I thought he would be the author. But,
Yeah.
so now I'm this author, and, very proud of the resource that I put out into the world. And I'm also a speaker. So, I go out into the public and talk about mental illness, suicide, loss, and grief. And, now I'm a certified grief educator. If you had told me that I would be a grief educator 5 or 6 years ago, I don't know if I would have screamed or laughed, but, so I think that's my identity, is that I've learned that over the course of the 4.5 years, that a big part of my healing is being around other people who have experienced the same thing. First with our support group, being with people who understood what we had experienced. And now with the grief groups that I offer for bereaved parents, with these moms that are often in those deep, dark, early days of grief. It's my honor, it's my privilege to hear their stories and to come alongside them. And so, I think that, my work now, that's my life's work. That's my mission. That's my purpose for the rest of, my years here on planet Earth.
Yeah.
And so I think, that, and none of those things were on the horizon prior to losing Max. None of them.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
we'll say that, I think this is providential because I had some skills that have lent themselves to what I'm doing.
Okay.
I had always been a journaler. And so, when my therapist said to me, journal and try to process your thoughts and feelings, that wasn't the first time I ever picked up a pen and piece of paper to do that. And then I have a background in corporate training, so I'm very comfortable speaking in front of groups. And
Hmm.
that has really aided me as I've gone into different venues and organizations to talk. And then, I've also facilitated groups for a lot of years, small groups of couples or women. And so that's prepared me to offer my grief groups as well. And so,
Yeah.
some of the skills and background that I have are now being applied and used in what I'm doing, but the trajectory is completely different than I ever
Yeah.
would be.
Right. I was going to say, and who would ever thought that that would be the case? And we know that, grief is when you do the work within yourself and when you kind of answer the call, because this just kind of goes, this is the way that the world is. There's a job for everybody
Mhm.
because there's always something that's going on. And we just so happen to have experienced the loss and have decided to do something with the loss. And now our jobs are grief educators, grief coaches, and speakers, and things of that nature, authors of it. And so this has, grief propels you into your purpose, and it gets you, it's the catalyst into what you were really set here on this earth to do. And we hate that, we had to experience these things, but this is the way that the world is, and someone's dying every day.
Mhm.
And now someone who has answered their call, and which is a part of their purpose, now they're able to help people who are coming along their path.
Mm.
And that's just kind of the way that the world works. Would you say, what would you say that losing Max, what did that expose in you to find out about yourself, that you just kind of, that you're taking along the journey with you to become a better you?
Well, I will say that I still have a long way to go in that regard. I think in one of our previous conversations, too, we talked about the fact that, I grew up in a codependent family. And so I have always taken on other people's pain and problems. And I've often said, I talk about this in my book, that it was a good thing that Max didn't get seriously ill as a little boy,
Yeah.
because I think that that would have imploded our family, imploded my marriage. I just think it would have been a disaster because I would have devoted 100% of my time to finding the right treatments, the right medications, the right doctors. And it would have been to the point of it being an obsession. As it was, he didn't get his first diagnosis until he was 18, almost 19. And then his second diagnosis came at 19, almost 20. And he very much kept me at arm's length during those years because he felt like he was an adult and so he should be able to handle this on his own. And that was very difficult for me to accept because I would see that he wasn't always taking the best care of himself, that he
Yeah.
wasn't always getting what he needed, from medication, from doctors, from various treatments. And so that was very difficult for me. And so I learned, I guess I kind of knew it then, but I've learned, that I couldn't save him. I couldn't save Max. And I would have tried like heck if it had happened if he had been diagnosed at, 6 or 8 or 10,
Yeah.
even 12. So I've learned that, I have a tendency to maybe think of myself as, a savior, and to try to step in and, help and save. And I can't do that. That's, losing a child, I think, is one of the greatest lessons in learning about the illusion we have as parents of control. We
Mhm.
think we have far more control than we actually do. And I thought I had way more control, maybe than the average parent. And so to lose him, it was just, gosh, that illusion was just, you know, revealed for what it was, an illusion.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I think that's what I've learned, Now I wish I could say that, I'm free from that, but I'm not. You know, I
Yeah.
I still, I have situations regularly that, something will come up and I'll think, "Oh gosh, I need to insert myself and help and fix." And I can't do that. You know,
Yeah.
and frankly, my own grief helped to clarify that because, I have lots of people in my life who wanted to fix my grief. And when they tried, all it did was make me furious. Because
Yeah.
and so I have to remind myself of that when I see somebody who's struggling and I try to step in and make it all better. I just can't do that. I don't have that power.
Yeah. And I like that when I'm dealing with my clients, I always tell them there's always this particular words that they use when it comes from conditioning of their childhood and from how they grew up. And so your word is codependency. And so back then it has a negative connotation to it because of what it brought along and why you were codependent then and why others may have been codependent on you, just depending on the family dynamic. So then, like you said, you grew up and you're getting into being an adult. Now you're a wife, now you're a mother. And so you find yourself kind of codependent in that. But once we go through certain things and become exposed to ourselves or become awakened to ourselves, that word can actually change. Because now that you understand that your purpose in this world is to serve,
Mm-hmm.
your purpose in this world is to come alongside others and help them where you needed help but didn't know how to get the help, but now you know how to give the help. And so we sometimes people don't understand that even that word codependency, it's good for you to depend on someone else to have something that you don't have
Mm-hmm.
or to have something else that can benefit you in certain areas of your life, because you wouldn't be a wife if you didn't have a husband. You guys have to be codependent with each other in a healthy way in order to make your marriage thrive, right? And so taking that word away from yourself and saying, no, I am a companion now. I'm not codependent. I am a companion to these people. I am a companion to my services. I am a companion to my husband. Now, is it if my services were to go away, and this is the scary part about that, because if for whatever reason you weren't able to do what you do as a grief educator, as a facilitator, if that were to go away and that's pulled away from you, if you are codependent on that, then you lose it all again.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is where we start to separate that word. Can I be a companion and come in and help, or am I clinged on to you because this is all I have from the pain that I've experienced?
Mm-hmm.
That's where it gets sticky.
Yeah. Gosh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
That's really something to think about.
Yeah. um but I think that your book and how you put all of your pain into words, and how you depended on that book in order to process what you were feeling. Because as I was reading it, it was, if you put down your feelings and the rawness of everything that you were experiencing at that time, you put it in such a way that is kind of unexplainable. And maybe it's because it's your own unique grief,
Mm.
but it's still relatable, but it still lets people know that this is not a pretty picture.
Mm.
This is painful.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to turn my pain into purpose and put it into words where I could digest it, and hopefully you can digest it in just reading it. So Erin, tell us a little bit about your book, and because I know that it came from the 18 months after Max had passed away. But give us some detail on that book and how we could even get a hold of it.
Okay. Well, I already talked about, the fact that I was journaling, and that's kind of where the book just sort of evolved. I never sat down and thought I should write a book about my story. It just kind of evolved. And I've also talked about that it was frankly what got me out of bed for probably the first, couple of years following Max's death. But, you know, I read several books on child loss they were helpful, but they were so heavy. And so, and I don't frankly know where this idea came from, but I thought, how can I balance that heaviness, this raw pain? And so I knew I wanted to make it visually appealing in some way. And so my graphic designer was just the perfect person to find. And again, I just think that was providential that I found her. It was a total God thing that she and I connected, worked so well together that it was almost like she got in my head and figured out what the book should look like. And so in the days and weeks following Max's death, I kept seeing the same bird over and over. So after she read, the first, I don't know, say 16 journal entries, she said, let's make the bird the theme of the book. So she painted 6 original watercolor illustrations of a bird that appear throughout the book. So there's just so much beauty in the book. And then, she took our family photos. I just love the pictures that are in the book. And she laid them out in these scrapbook, these full spread scrapbook kind of fashion. It's just so beautiful. And so I think that, and then the other idea she had was every journal entry has a heading, kind of what you can sort of expect when you're reading it. And then she pulled out quotes throughout the book. So I think what the finished product is somebody who is in those early days of grief, because one thing that a lot of people in early grief say is that they can't read, they can't focus. And, I didn't have that experience myself. It was frankly kind of an escape for me to read, even grief books. But they can take my book and they can flip through it and just first look at the pictures and the illustrations. They can just read the pull out quotes and get a feel. It's laid out chronologically. So, maybe they're coming up on the holidays and they're wondering how they're going to navigate that. So they could read the section, November and December, navigating the holidays. So I just think it's accessible. I think it's digestible. I think it is something that almost anybody can pick up and get something from. And I think that's been the most surprising thing about the book, Carlise, is I've had parents who have children that struggle with a mental illness who've reached out to me after reading my book, because I think it helps them to understand what their child is dealing with. And, as an example, one of the things I talk about in the book is that when Max was in a depressive episode, several times, often he would come home. And he would be in his bed, in his room, and I would be so uncomfortable that I would go into his bedroom and drag him out of bed, take him to Target, take him on a walk, do something. And I realized that it would have been much more beneficial if I'd sat in his room with him and rubbed his back and told him, this would pass. He would get through it. But I couldn't do that. And so, that's a piece of advice that I've given to parents who have children that struggle with a diagnosis of depression. But then I've also, connected with people who've been touched by suicide, not just suicide of a child, but any suicide, because it's such a traumatic way to lose somebody. And then I've connected with people that are walking alongside the grieving, because I had many friends who read my book and said, I had no idea the kind of pain you were in. And I'm so thankful that I read your book. So now I know how to be there for somebody. And then clinicians read it who have said it helps them understand the grieving process of their clients. So, that has been just a blessing to me to see how it kind of hits people where they are. That's been incredibly gratifying, because I was just a mom telling my story. And so to know that it kind of hits all those buttons is, I feel like that is just such an honor for me and also for Max.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful book, everyone. So you have to get it. You have to read it. It's a really, really beautiful book, because it's subtle, but it's very, very impactful. Very, very impactful.
Thank you.
And how do they get your book, Erin?
So it's available on Amazon. It's available on Amazon in both print and a Kindle. And then it's also available on Barnes and Noble. So, and Books a Million, so people can get it in both the print and Kindle version on those outlets. BookBub, and also for bookstores or libraries that want to order it, they can order it through Ingham Spark. And
Awesome.
bookstores and libraries get a discounted rate on the
Awesome.
website. So.
And you have some grief support groups that I think you had one that just started, or is one starting here soon?
So I'm in the middle of one right now.
Okay.
Actually, we just finished our 4th week. My grief groups are 6 weeks. They're online. We meet via Zoom on Tuesday evenings from 7 to 8 Eastern Standard Time. And so my next one will probably start in mid-March. And I just offer them periodically. I think short term is helpful because, again, when people are grieving, sometimes they can only sign up for a short time frame. But then I have lots of people who repeat the groups and do them numerous times. So yeah, that's definitely something I love, because then I really get to know people and I'm really able to come alongside them and also watch how they encourage and support one another. That's one of the most beautiful things about support groups is to watch the support that happens amongst them. So,
and I can only imagine too that it's rewarding when you see even the repeat people that come and see they're evolving. How now they're grieving, now that they're 12 weeks in, now that they're and even if they take a break in between, when they come back and they're doing it again, because usually you do that when you are, a lot of the times when people are in support groups, they only get one section of where they're really feeling it at that point. Even if you hit on 9 points, they only get 1 and 2 because that's where they are. And so, of course, they come back again so that they can, get through the next section. So I wonder, I can only imagine how rewarding that is for you to see the evolvement of your people that come into the groups. That's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have any other goals or any other things that are coming down the pipeline that you want to share with us?
Oh gosh.
Projects?
Yeah, I have thought about turning the framework of my book into a guided journal because I think it would lend itself to that. And I know how helpful journaling was for me to, sit down and take something that was swirling around in my head and actually put it down on paper and have it make sense. Because a lot of times our thoughts don't make sense to us. So that's an idea that I've had. And then, really, I just think expanding my reach, coming alongside more bereaved parents, doing more, speaking engagements. I'm actually in May going out to a conference in California to speak to a couple hundred bereaved moms. And that is, that's such an honor to be asked to do that and come alongside them, because I know many of them will be newly bereaved. And, just again, I think to offer that hope that healing is possible at a time when you can't even imagine that. You can't see beyond, this day. And so that's, I really just want to expand my reach with my speaking, with my book, with my grief groups, and just continue to, pursue this because, I get to talk about Max every day. And I look at other parents who aren't doing what I'm doing and thinking, are they able to talk about their child that they lost every day? And I feel so fortunate. I feel so blessed and fortunate that I can talk about him, that I can tell stories about him, that I can keep his memory alive every single day. And that is just such a blessing to me.
Awesome. Well, Erin, tell us how we can get in contact with you, and everything that she says, I will have in her bio under the podcast. So you will have the links and the contact information to get a hold of her. How can we get in contact with you, Erin?
So I think the best way is through my website. It's kind of a one-stop shop, has information about my book, my speaking, my grief groups, ways to contact me, my social media links. But that is erinblechman.com. And my last name is Blechman. So erinblechman.com is probably the best way to reach me and find out a little bit more about what I do. So.
Awesome. Well, Erin, thank you for coming into the shadow box and being vulnerable with us, being transparent, and shedding some light on suicide, shedding some light on how parents are grieving, your own grief journey, and just giving us that insight on Max, because he sounds like a very beautiful boy.
Hmm.
So I thank you for that.